Formally, what has been said can be expressed thus. The general nature of the judgment or proposition, which involves the distinction of subject and predicate, is destroyed by the speculative proposition, and the proposition of identity which the former becomes contains the counter-thrust against that subject-predicate relationship. This conflict between the general form of a proposition and the unity of the notion, which destroys it, is similar to the conflict that occurs in rhythm between meter and accent. Rhythm results from the floating centre and the unification of the two. So too, in the philosophical proposition, the identification of subject and predicate is not meant to destroy the difference between them, which the form of the proposition expresses. Their unity, rather, is meant to emerge as a harmony. The form of the proposition is the appearance of the determinate sense or the accent that distinguishes its fulfillment, and that the predicate expresses the substance, and that the subject itself falls into the universal. This is the unity in which the accent dies away. To illustrate what has been said, in the proposition God is being, the predicate is being, it has the significance of something substantial in which the subject is dissolved. Being is here meant to be not a predicate but rather the essence. It seems consequently that God ceases to be what he is from his position in the proposition, viz. A fixed subject. Here thinking, instead of making progress in the transition from subject to predicate, in reality feels itself checked by the loss of the subject, and missing it, is thrown back onto the thought of the subject. Or, since the predicate itself has been expressed as a subject, as the being or essence which exhausts the nature of the subject, thinking finds the subject immediately in the predicate, and now, having returned into itself in the predicate, instead of being in a position where it has freedom for argument, it is still absorbed in the content, or at least is faced with a demand that it should be. Similarly to when one says the actual is the universal, the actual as subject disappears in its predicate. The universal is not meant to have merely the significance of a predicate, as if the proposition asserted only that the actual is universal. On the contrary, the universal is meant to express the essence of the actual. Thinking therefore loses the firm objective basis it had in the subject. When in the predicate, it is thrown back onto the subject, and when in the predicate, it does not return into itself, but into the subject of the content. This abnormal inhibition of thought is in large measure the source of the complaints regarding the intelligibility, or rather the unintelligibility, of the philosophical writings of individuals who otherwise possess the educational requirements for understanding them. Here we see the reason behind one particular complaint so often made against them, that so much has to be read over and over before it can be understood, a complaint whose burden is presumed to be quite outrageous and, if justified, to admit of no defence. It is clear from the above that what this amounts to, the philosophical proposition, since it is a proposition, leads one to believe that the usual subject-predicate relation obtains, as well as the usual attitude towards knowing. But the philosophical content destroys this attitude and this opinion. We learn by experience that we meant something other than we meant to mean, and this correction of our meaning compels our knowing to go back to the proposition and understand it in some other way. One difficulty which should be avoided comes from mixing up the speculative with the ratiocinative methods, so that what is said of the subject at one time signifies its notion, at another merely its predicate or accidental property. The one method interferes with the other, and only a philosophical exposition that rigidly excludes the usual way of relating the parts of the proposition could achieve the goal of plasticity. As a matter of fact, non-speculative thinking also has its valid rights which are disregarded in the speculative way of stating a proposition. The sublation of the form of the proposition must not happen only in an immediate manner through the mere content of the proposition. On the contrary, this opposite movement must find explicit expression. It must not just be the inward inhibition mentioned above. This return of the notion into itself must be set forth. This movement, which constitutes what formerly the proof was supposed to accomplish, is the dialectical movement of the proposition itself. This alone is the speculative in act, and only the expression of this movement is a speculative exposition. As a proposition, the speculative is only the internal inhibition and the non-existential return of the essence into itself. Hence we often find in philosophical expositions referring us to this inner intuition, and in this way they evade the systematic exposition of the dialectical movement of the proposition which we have demanded. The proposition should express what the true is, but essentially the true is subject. As such, it is merely the dialectical movement. This course that generates itself, going forth from and returning to itself. In non-speculative cognition, proof constitutes this side of expressed inwardness. But once the dialectic has been separated from proof, the notion of philosophical demonstration has been lost. Here we should bear in mind that the dialectical movement likewise has propositions for its parts or elements. The difficulty just indicated seems therefore to recur perpetually and to be inherent in the very nature of philosophical exposition. This is like what happens in ordinary proof, where the reasons given are themselves in need of further reasons and so on ad infinitum. This pattern of giving reasons and stating conditions belongs to that method of proof which differs from the dialectical movement and belongs therefore to external cognition. As regards the dialectical movement itself, its element is the one notion. It thus has a content which is in its own self subject through and through. Thus no content occurs which functions as an underlying subject, nor receives its meaning as a predicate. The proposition as it stands is merely an empty form. Apart from the self that is sensuously intuited or represented, it is above all the name as name that designates the pure subject, the empty unit without thought content. For this reason it may be expedient, for example, to avoid the name God, since this word is not immediately also a notion, but rather the proper name, the fixed point of rest of the underlying subject. Whereas, on the other hand, for example, being, or the one, singularity, the subject, etc., themselves at once suggest concepts. Even if the speculative truths are affirmed of this subject, their content lacks the immanent notion, because it is present merely in the form of a passive subject, with the result that such truths readily assume the form of mere edification. From this side, too, the habit of expressing the speculative predicate in the form of a proposition and not as notion and essence creates a difficulty that can be increased or diminished through the very way in which philosophy is expounded. In keeping with our insight into the nature of speculation, the exposition should preserve the dialectical form and should admit nothing except insofar as it is comprehended in terms of the notion and is the notion. The study of philosophy is as much hindered by the conceit that will not argue as it is by the argumentative approach. This conceit relies on truths which are taken for granted and which it sees no need to re-examine. It just lays them down and believes it is entitled to assert them, as well as to judge and pass sentence by appealing to them. In view of this, it is especially necessary that philosophizing should again be made a serious business. In the case of all other sciences, arts, skills and crafts, everyone is convinced that a complex and laborious program of learning and practice is necessary for competence. Yet when it comes to philosophy, there seems to be a currently prevailing prejudice to the effect that although not everyone who has eyes and fingers and is given leather and last is at once in a position to make shoes, everyone nevertheless immediately understands how to philosophize and how to evaluate philosophy, since he possesses the criterion for doing so in his natural reason, as if he did not likewise possess the measure for a shoe in his own foot. It seems that philosophical competence consists precisely in an absence of information and study, as though philosophy left off where they began. Philosophy is frequently taken to be a purely formal kind of knowledge void of content, and the insight is sadly lacking that whatever truth there may be in the content of any discipline or science, it can only deserve the name if such truth has been engendered by philosophy. Let other sciences try to argue as much as they like without philosophy. Without it they can have in them neither life, spirit, nor truth. In place of the long process of culture towards genuine philosophy, a movement as rich as it is profound, through which spirit achieves knowledge, we are offered as quite equivalent either direct revelations from heaven or the sound common sense that has never laboured over or informed itself regarding other knowledge or genuine philosophy. And we are assured that these are quite as good substitutes as some claim chicory is for coffee. It is not a pleasant experience to see ignorance and crudity, without form or taste, which cannot focus its thought on a single abstract proposition, still less on a connected chain of them, claiming at one moment to be freedom of thought and toleration, and the next to be even genius. Genius, we all know, was once all the rage in poetry, as it is now in philosophy. But when its productions made sense at all, such genius begat only trite prose instead of poetry, or getting beyond that, only crazy rhetoric. So nowadays, philosophizing by the light of nature, which regards itself as too good for the notion, and as being an intuitive and poetic thinking in virtue of this deficiency, brings to market the arbitrary combinations of an imagination that has only been disorganized by its thoughts, an imagery that is neither fish nor flesh, neither poetry nor philosophy. On the other hand, when philosophizing by the light of nature flows along the more even course of sound common sense, it offers at its very best only a rhetoric of trivial truths, and if reproached with the insignificance of these truths, it assures us in reply that their meaning and fulfilment reside in its heart, and must surely be present in the hearts of others too, since it reckons to have said the last word once the innocence of the heart, the purity of conscience, and such like, have been mentioned. These are ultimate truths to which no exception can be taken, and beyond which nothing more can be demanded. It is just the point, however, that the best should not remain in the recesses of what is inner, but should be brought out of these depths into the light of day. But it would be better by far to spare oneself the effort of bringing forth ultimate truths of that kind, for they have long since been available in catechisms, or in popular sayings, etc. It is not difficult to grasp such vague and misleading truths, or even to show that the mind in believing them is also aware of their very opposite. When it labours to extricate itself from the bewilderment this sets up, it falls into contradictions, and may very well burst out with the assertion that the question is settled. That so and so is the truth, and that the other views are sophistries. For sophistry is a slogan used by ordinary common sense against educated reason. Just as the expression visionary dreaming sums up once and for all what philosophy means to those who are ignorant of it. Since the man of common sense makes his appeal to feeling, to an oracle within his breast, he has finished and done with anyone who does not agree. He only has to explain that he has nothing more to say to anyone who does not find and feel the same in himself. In other words, he tramples underfoot the roots of humanity, for it is the nature of humanity to press onward to agreement with others. Human nature only really exists in an achieved community of minds. The anti-human, the merely animal, consists in staying within the sphere of feeling and being able to communicate only at that level. Should anyone ask for a royal road to science, there is no more easy-going way than to rely on sound common sense, and for the rest, in order to keep up with the times, and with advances in philosophy, to read reviews of philosophical works, perhaps even to read their prefaces and first paragraphs, for these preliminary pages give the general principles on which everything turns, and the reviews, as well as providing historical accounts, also provide the critical appraisal which, being a judgment, stands high above the work judged. This common road can be taken in casual dress, but the high sense for the eternal, the holy, the infinite strides along in the robes of a high priest on a road that is from the first no road, but has immediate being as its centre. The genius of profound original ideas and lofty flashes of inspiration are not yet the empyrean. True thoughts and scientific insight are only to be won through the labour of the notion. Only the notion can produce the universality of knowledge, which is neither common vagueness nor the inadequacy of your ordinary common sense, but a fully developed perfect cognition, nor the uncommon universality of a reason whose talents have been ruined by indolence and the conceit of genius, but a truth ripened to its properly matured form, so as to be capable of being the property of all self-conscious reason. Since I hold that science exists solely in the self-movement of the notion, and since my view differs from, and is in fact wholly opposed to, current ideas regarding the nature and form of truth, both those referred to above and other peripheral aspects of them, it seems that any attempt to expound the system of science from this point of view is unlikely to be favourably received. In the meantime, I can bear in mind that if at times the excellence of Plato's philosophy has been held to lie in his scientifically valueless myths, there have been times, even called times of ecstatic dreaming, when Aristotle's philosophy was esteemed for its speculative depth, and Plato's Parmenides, surely the greatest artistic achievement of the ancient dialectic, was regarded as the true disclosure and positive expression of the divine life, and times when, despite the obscurity generated by ecstasy, this misunderstood ecstasy was in fact supposed to be nothing else than the pure notion. Furthermore, what really is excellent in the philosophy of our time takes its value to lie in its scientific quality, and even though others take a different view, it is in fact only in virtue of its scientific character that it exerts any influence. Hence I may hope too that this attempt to vindicate science for the notion, and to expound it in its proper element, will succeed in winning acceptance through the inner truth of the subject matter. We must hold to the conviction that it is the nature of truth to prevail when its time has come, and that it appears only when this time has come, and therefore never appears prematurely, nor finds a public not ripe to receive it. Also, we must accept that the individual needs that this should be in order to verify what is as yet a matter for himself alone, and to experience the conviction which in the first place belongs only to a particular individual, as something universally held. But in this connection the public must often be distinguished from those who pose as its representatives and spokesmen. In many respects the attitude of the public is quite different from, even contrary to, that of these spokesmen. Whereas the public is inclined good-naturedly to blame itself when a philosophical work makes no appeal to it, those others, certain of their own competence, put all the blame on the author. The effect of such a work on the public is more noiseless than the action of these dead men when they bury their dead. The general level of insight now is altogether more educated, its curiosity more awake, its judgment more swiftly reached, so that the feet of those who will carry you out are already at the door. But from this we must often distinguish the more gradual effect which corrects the attention extorted by imposing assurances, and corrects too contemptuous censure, and gives some writers an audience only after a time, while others after a time have no audience left. For the rest, at the time when the universality of spirit has gathered such strength, and the singular detail, as is fitting, has become correspondingly less important, when, too, that universal aspect claims and holds on to the whole range of the wealth it has developed, the share in the total work of spirit which falls to the individual can only be very small. Because of this, the individual must all the more forget himself, as the nature of science implies and requires. Of course he must make of himself and achieve what he can, but less must be demanded of him, just as he in turn can expect less of himself, and may demand less for himself.